So moving on, at this point in the symposium, you probably have some pretty good ideas about what you should be doing to be cyber secure, but critically, how then do you do it? How do you find the resources? How do you decide on the budget? And how do you do that without breaking the bank? Because we all know that high-priced cybersecurity professionals are hard to find. So, to dive deep on that topic, I'd now like to welcome up Stahl from Citadel Information Group, Kierstin Todt from the Cyber Readiness Institute, and to interview them from the Wall Street Journal, my colleague, Kimberly Johnson.
Good morning. Thank you, Stan and Kierstin. So as my colleague Nick said, we've heard a lot of information today. How do you begin the process to figure out how to pay for cyber readiness or preparedness? Kierstin.
So it's a great question because I think we hear often a lot of things to do, but actually fleshing them out into exactly how what that means for you as a business and the decisions that you have to make. And one of the first pieces, and we've heard a little bit about this morning, is you can't secure everything equally. And so you have to prioritize what is critical to the mission of your organization. What, if you lost, would seriously disrupt what you're doing, or in the case of small businesses, take you offline. So there's that focus. And I think the other part of this is doubling your security budget doesn't double your security. You have to be thoughtful about what you're doing and how you're doing it. The other piece that we're starting to see more happen around, and that really is understanding how to impact security, particularly from a financially effective perspective, is focusing on your employees from a human behavior perspective. Employees, we heard earlier about employees as victims following a breach. Employees can also be your most powerful tool in security. You have to educate them about the basics. And certainly, I think we're still struck by the fact that we're talking about basics in 2019, 2020. Happy New Year, everybody. But it's the idea that focusing on human behavior, focusing on your employees as powerful security tools in your toolbox is really where we need to be going.
And Stan, would you concur with that? You work with a number of small businesses through the nonprofit you're with.
Exactly, and I completely agree that the first thing, I mean, you've got to know what information that you've got out there, what the consequences would be if that information were either compromised or lost, made unavailable, whatever those things are, so that you're then in a position to begin to say, okay, this stuff we've got to absolutely positively protect. This stuff, yeah, it's important, but let's not put the resources there. Let's, where's the low-hanging fruit, if you will. And I think also when you're looking at small businesses where you're looking at information that is spread over a small but still somewhat, not just a single device. You could have, let's say, 10s or 20s or even 100 or so workstations, a couple more than that. You could have cloud stuff, you could have servers in-house and all. Just knowing where all that information is, it becomes really a critical piece to being able to protect it. Completely agree with what you said about people.
Not sure, is that the most cost-effective way to get to become prepared and to be ready?
Well, it is in part. I think the most cost-effective thing you can do is for the executive to absolutely, positively commit that we're going to get this done. It's a vital function of the business that we secure ourselves. I, the executive, am committed to making that happen. I'm appointing someone as my security manager, and I want everybody in the company to know that when the security manager speaks, he or she is speaking for me. If you can create that tone at the top, everything else can now flow.
Right. How do you, for the people that are here today, how do they go back to their workplace and get that buy-in? Is it a matter of creating allies that then feed into the top? Stephen Bernard talked about that as well earlier this morning. So how do you two talk to small companies about getting that level of buy-in?
Yeah.
So I think exactly what Stan said is you've got to go to the CEO. And often what we find with small businesses is that the CEO can often be your head of financial, the CFO, the head of HR. Everyone can have multiple hats. But you do have to get the buy-in from the top. And one of the things that we're doing with the Cyber Readiness program is we also identify somebody within the organization that takes on cybersecurity. I think the point that was made by Stephen Bernard around who is responsible for making those decisions, that's important at Sony, and it's also important for the 5-person company. When something happens, who do you turn to say, what do I need to do, what needs to be done? We saw that back in 2015 with President Obama in the OPM breach. I served as executive director of his commission, and the reason why that commission was started was because he didn't know who to turn to within the government to say, this happened, what do we do now? So we see it at the broadest levels of government and industry, and it absolutely applies to small businesses and to small companies with a fewer number of employees. You've got to find the authority within the senior executives and whoever they are, and then also have the right roles and responsibilities laid out.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've done that. And now the next step is the security function. And I cannot go in, if I'm a company, I may not be able to afford a CISO, but there are many options, off-the-shelf sorts of options. How do I begin to think about that? Yeah. And thinking about, well, this is an investment. I've proved to the company that this is an investment. But then how do I make a prudent financial decision?
Yeah, that's such a critical challenge. We have a client, they're a nonprofit that's quite large and quite well positioned in their particular marketplace, where the executive director he's focused on the nonprofit side of what they do, and anything technical is outside of his thinking. I mean, it's just not where he's at that way. And in that case, security was being led by IT, and IT came to recognize, properly so, that they needed outside help, so they turned to us for that. But even beyond that, and what we've helped them with is then, okay, how do you build alliances within the organization so that you can begin to put enough of these allies in place so that now when you speak to the executive director, that executive director has a chance of understanding what needs to be done here. It's not just the IT guy saying, hey, we got a problem, but it's IT, and it's the risk management side of the nonprofit, and it's the finance side, and so on. So now there's a coalition that can go up to the executive and help them with that. And I think I'd like to think that that's just part of the value that a firm like ours can bring, like yours is as well, that we're in that position. We don't cost a lot of money, but we add a lot of leverage in that space because we've got that kind of expertise as to how you transition the culture, how you help the culture adapt into the kinds of things that you said at the very outset of this of this session, to get everybody involved that way. So I think that's a piece of it, if you will. Right. Yeah.
What about the technical piece of it?
Oh, so that I was just going to say that I think for businesses, remember cybersecurity is a new line item. We haven't had it on budgets for very long, and so when you look at creating cultural change, adding a line item and understanding how to prioritize that for your company is important. And I think there's the recognition and certainly a lot of resources to outsource certain technical capabilities. As we all know, sort of strength comes from knowing what you do well and knowing what you don't do well or have the resources to bring in. Oftentimes, bringing in a CISO is not an option for a business. So fortunately, there are a lot of opportunities, vendors out there that can help outsource some of those capabilities. But what's really important for any business, and particularly small businesses, is that outsourcing capabilities doesn't outsource responsibility. And so you have to pay attention to what's going on. There's a lot of momentum and inertia around going to the cloud. And the cloud certainly has capabilities, whichever cloud service provider you see, but you've got to pay attention to how your data is being managed. And just because somebody else has it doesn't mean that your security and your role for securing that data has been minimized in any way. And so to your earlier point about what do you do, how do you do this? There are multiple steps, but certainly the outsourcing of those capabilities is an efficient and cost-effective way to handle that resource.
And you said something I thought really vital in that you can outsource the expertise, you can't outsource the responsibility. That responsibility belongs with the business themselves, and part of our role is to help educate the business so that their security manager is capable of taking on that responsibility. And then using companies like ours, other kinds of companies that are out there as well that do what we do, as the, if you will, the subject matter experts. We can push and prod and lead and do those kinds of things, but at the end of the day, it's the business that has to make the decision that we're going to do this or we're not going to do that. It goes back to what we heard earlier, that there are these moments of truth that who's going to have the authority to shut down the system should that be necessary. Right. That's not something you can outsource.
Right. There's financial responsibility as well in those scenarios, because you don't want to be in a situation where there is a breach and you're in a crisis mode and then you're squabbling over, well, I don't really want this department, I don't want to pay for this, well, this is too much money. How do you talk to businesses about avoiding a financial squabble at a time of crisis?
So we've heard it today, but it can't be said enough, which is the planning and preparation. So we talked about an incident response plan. So I've referenced the work that we do at the Cyber Readiness Institute. It's a free program that's online at becyberready.com, and one of the things that we offer is a template for incident response plans. Stan's organization has similar resources. The idea is to test and exercise. I can't stress exercising enough. It's not something that just is meant for the Pentagon. It's not something that's just meant for large global corporations. Every business needs to exercise what it does. I recently did a tabletop exercise for a large energy company, and we were exercising a ransomware attack. And so they were faced with the decision around, as a company, what's our moral authority to negotiate with a malicious actor? But the other piece that's much more relevant is they said, well, we have backups, but when they went to test the backups, they weren't operating. So it's just this idea that you may have gone one step, but you've got to make sure that you're truly testing everything. So
do you
in
test
a time
your
of crisis.
spend?
Excuse me?
Do you test your financial spend?
Yes, and so that's the other part of it. What are you willing to spend? So that was for ransomware. It's what they went back to was they actually went back to their company's mission. And in their mission, it said, we are an ethical company that adheres to moral and ethical principles. Not every company will have that. But they were able to then say, our ransomware policy is based on our mission statement. You've got to go through that thinking and the psychology, because you don't, the age-old phrase, you don't want to be exchanging business cards in a time of crisis. You don't want to be squabbling over who's making those decisions and how to make them in a time of crisis.
Yeah.
Right. Are small and medium-sized businesses getting better about thinking about these issues? What's changed? What's evolved?
Yeah, I see it very situationally. I mean, the companies that come to us, more companies are coming to us now, but that's perhaps simply a function of the reality, the world we live in. And it goes to the numbers that were just up on the survey. That's a very self-selecting group, that 50% or 80% or whatever the percents were, who are doing training or have an incident response plan. That's the people here in this room. I'm most concerned, and this is part of the Secure the Village, why we started it, is all the companies that don't yet know what these challenges are and how they have to respond to them, and all the IT vendors, the MSPs as well, who are still really don't have their arms around cybersecurity yet. So I think that becomes just one more piece of it. I think we're going far too slowly in raising the alarm, if you will. I see this analogous in its own way to Dunkirk in 1940, when the British had to get the army out of France to save the army, and Churchill mobilized people to go across the channel in rowboats and whatever to get people back. We got to get everybody involved that same way. It's great for everybody in this room, but I'm looking beyond the people, all of you, at all the other businesses that are out there.
You run a Readiness Institute, so are we ready?
It's a great question. I think readiness is never a destination.
Correct.
I used to work in drug policy, and the director at the time, General Barry McCaffrey, said he hated the term war on terror because that meant that somebody, or war on drugs as well, because somebody would win or lose, but it was an ongoing battle. And I think we should never be thinking that we're going to hit a destination. That's not meant to dissuade us, it's not meant to create fear, but should actually empower each of us to take on the responsibility to be secure. And so while we're moving, and in some ways we're preaching to the choir in this audience, I think you're starting to see everyone recognize the role that cybersecurity plays in the mission of every organization.
Yeah.
Right. And are you seeing smaller companies? I mean, I think 5 years ago when we talked about cybersecurity, we weren't necessarily talking about the mom and pop shop. But now they're connected, they're doing digital transactions on their iPhones via a Square dongle. Are you seeing smaller and smaller businesses even begin to think about this because they are more digital in doing all of these transactions?
It's a great question because I worked on the NIST framework, and back in 2014, 2013.
Can you explain what that is?
So the National Institute of Standards and Technology was tasked by President Obama in 2013 and 14 to come up with a voluntary framework to help infrastructure companies become more cyber secure. And so what it was created by industry for industry. And one of the initial conversations was, this isn't about the mom and pop pizza shop on the corner, it's about infrastructure companies. But we are now in a day and age where when you're going to a market and you're using Square or you're using an iPad to do a transaction, the interdependencies of our global supply chains have only proliferated. And so every business is connected to another business. And so when we look at who should be thinking about security when we're talking about the security of the nation and the digital economy, every business has a role. It might not be in the first degree, but you can be certain that you are connected in some way to a larger company that has that role and responsibility.
Yeah. And we see that as well, that connection playing out in that more and more we're seeing small businesses who are being asked by their customers, who are these are business to business matters, what are you doing to protect the information of mine that you have? We're seeing that with financial institutions who are asking those questions of their vendors. We're seeing it with law firms being asked much more deeply than we've ever seen before. What are you doing to protect our information? And I think with the California Consumer Privacy Act as well, even though it only applies to businesses above a certain size, $25 million or more, or having lots of data that you're collecting, part of the reasonableness definition of security is that you can't have reasonable security practices unless you're pushing those practices down onto your third-party vendors and your suppliers. So I think that also adds to the momentum is building, if you will, around this, fortunately.
Right. So if I'm supplying technology, goods, and services to a larger company, do the larger companies expect the smaller companies to spend more? Because we had earlier we talked about, well, you don't necessarily have to spend more to be better prepared, but is that same level of thinking at a larger company?
I think we're in a tough place because what you see a lot right now, particularly in regulated industry, are compliance in standards. And where one of the things that the Trump administration did back in 2017, which was an evolution of previous administrations, is it talked about risk management as the fundamental tenet for how to address cybersecurity. And risk management isn't about just a compliance checklist, but really evaluating your environment and what's important. And the issue that I am concerned about when you start to look at supply chain security is you're going to start with standards and compliance checklists because that's going to be the way to create a baseline. But we can't lose the risk management concept. Yeah. And I think that when large businesses are working with small businesses, they have a responsibility not just to expect security, but actually help those businesses become more secure by sharing resources, by allowing them to understand the vendors, the cloud service providers, other resources that they're accessing, so that the interconnectedness is not only a challenge, but it can also be a resource and an opportunity for global supply chains.
Yeah, right. I again concur greatly with what you just said, Kierstin. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing along the same line, I mean, obviously, it costs some money to get compliant or get secure, whatever those things are, whatever you're looking at. But the ability, and here again, this is where having an outside subject matter experts can really help. There's money involved, but you can also manage some of that. First of all, as much as anything, a company looking at one of its vendors, do you have an information security program? Again, it goes to, it's not a destination, it's a journey. So is there a program in place? Have you policies? Are you training your people?
Right,
These
and
are
that's
not
different
large
than
cost
having a
events.
person, a program
Yeah.
versus a person.
Yeah, exactly. And those aren't necessarily cost prohibitive. I mean, obviously there's some money involved in it, but it's you're not going to break the bank for those kinds of things. At the same time, I mean, we have seen horror stories, if you will. I mean, a IT vendor that says, oh, you need a firewall, it's going to cost you $50,000. And we looked at it and says, no, you don't need a $50,000 firewall. You need an $8,000 firewall. Let's sharpen the pencils here. We had another client had a $1.5 million proposal for PCI compliance. And, we looked at the scope of the project, and we, again, had the vendor do some pencil sharpening, and it ended up being a $500,000 project. Again, there's stuff you can do here that can limit how much money you have to spend, and all the money in the world isn't going to get you the security you need. What's most important is what we said at the very beginning, that tone at the top, that executive saying, hey, we're going to do this because in your case that you used with the mission, where there's a moral imperative to secure the information.
Right. So given that, and given what we've heard earlier today, and given what we're seeing in our environment, particularly the threat of nation states, and it's not just a matter of a nation state attacking a large entity. We're all vulnerable, from our credit union to probably our farmers market at some point.
Yeah.
When you see what's happening in current events today, and you think of these large-scale attacks, how do you talk to small businesses about that, who could be sitting here wondering, how concerned should I be in this escalation?
So Kimberly, I think it's a very important point, because what we heard following General Soleimani's death last week was, is a cyber attack imminent? And one of the things that I have pushed back on is I don't think that we need to be debating whether a cyber attack or a physical attack will be the tool of choice. We've seen a physical. We certainly should expect a cyber attack should be there. But just as when we feel a physical threat from a nation-state actor, we rely as Americans on our United States servicemen and women and the decision makers at the top levels of government to protect us. I think interestingly, when it comes to cybersecurity, we actually have an ability as individuals to play a role in the security of the nation, because what we do as individuals actually does have a broad impact on the security of the nation. We saw the statistics around phishing. One senior executive who is vulnerable to a phishing attempt can create access to a network. That's not meant to create, over dramatization. It's actually intended to say you actually do have a role here, and you have a responsibility, and you have an ability to make the nation more secure. So as individuals, I think what these nation-state threats, we have to bring them down, distill them to the role that individuals have in having stronger authentication. It's about doing the basics again. Reset your password if something's happened. Make sure you have strong education phishing programs, and you've integrated both awards for following them, but consequences when you don't. And then looking at how you integrate all of these into the culture, as Stan talked earlier, of cybersecurity. It's not an option anymore, and I don't think anyone in this room thinks it is, but we have to create cultures of security that start with the small businesses, go through the entire supply chain, because that actually does make a difference when we're talking about nation-state threats and nation-state actors and being more secure.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, and we heard from the earlier talks as well on it, by God, test your backups. Make sure your backups are there, they're offline, you're able to get to them should something happen, because we can't predict whether it's going to be a nation state or it's going to be somebody doing a business email compromise attack that just, if you will, a lone wolf even. So we got to be prepared against all of that. And so much of it is that defense at and again, it goes to the NIST framework, if you will. I mean, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. So, know where your stuff is, be protecting it, multi-factor authentication and training and blah, blah, blah. But then, by God, also make sure when that day comes, you can get your backups, you can restore them, and if it's deeper than just a restoration of backups, that you've got this whole plan in place that we talked about, the earlier panelists talked about as well.
Let's see if the audience have some questions for Kierstin and Stan. Any questions out there about resources, spending? Right here.
Thank you, Joseph Crisella with State Water Resource Control Board, Division of Drinking Water. Not really just a question, but calling attention also to the October 2018 America's Water Infrastructure Act. It calls water utilities to also include cybersecurity as part of their process of increasing resilience. And also tying into risk management, there's this other thing called consequence management. And that might help in the prioritization of resources. Put a value on the consequences, see if the consequences are acceptable. If not, then there's the value, and that might justify the cost of implementing the risks management actions that are needed.
Anything to add to the comment there?
I think it's a great point, because the other part of this is we talk a lot about prevention. We haven't mentioned and had too much of a discussion about resiliency, but that's a critical point of security. So it's making sure that when something does happen, it doesn't take you down. And importantly, it's also about learning from what's happened. You have the opportunity to do more than just test when an event happens. It's understanding how you've responded, what you could have done better. Where we sometimes fail in this life cycle of breaches is not truly extracting the lessons learned and then integrating them into the revision to our response plans, and understanding where we may have quantified a consequence, but in actuality, we recognize that that consequence may not have been quantified effectively. And I think it's a terrific point.
Yeah. And just to add to that as well, take advantage of the organizations around you that are already doing it. There's InfraGard, the ISSA, ISACA up in Los Angeles, and now in some other places around the country. The whole concept of Secure the Village, with nobody's as smart as everybody. We can learn, we can either make the mistakes ourselves, or we can learn from others who've already made those mistakes. I mean, that was the value of the Sony presentation earlier. Learn from other people. Don't try to go this alone.
Other questions? Microphone here, please, in the middle.
Hi, my name is Matt Reynolds. I'm the CIO for Marvin Engineering. We're a defense contractor. And a few years back, we were told that we need to be NIST 800-171 compliant, so we did all of that. And it's all self-certification today. And I understand that you were part of that NIST program. I was just curious, do you have any insight into when there's going to be, or what organizations are going to be used to actually certify, and when are official audits going to begin with the NIST compliance from a government perspective?
So I worked on the framework, which, unlike the standards, is voluntary, and continues to be so. I think the organizations that are involved in certification, I'm not directly involved in what's going on there. I think that it's to be determined, but what we have to be careful of in these situations is that you've got to create objective certification in how we're doing this. Self-certification, I think, is a first step, because it starts to get the inertia shift. But then when you're looking at the bodies to certify, I would expect that the government would partner with organizations like it's done in the past to ensure that there's a strong industry-government collaboration in how to certify. But I'm not aware of where that currently stands.
Yeah.
It sounds like somebody might be.
Okay, one more quick question.
Not a question, but a response. Thank you very much. So my understanding as it relates to 800-171 is there's a new approach to this, the cybersecurity maturity model that came out literally just in December. But again, I think the whole issue of doing an attestation or an audit or a third party. I reached out to the DoD to get clarification on how this is going to be handled. If you think about like PCI DSS, that you have a QSA or a public company with a registered auditor with the PCAOB, this isn't really clear yet. but I think the standard around, moving away from self-certification probably will add a little bit more assurance to the quality of the audits that are being done. So.
And a consistency, a common language.
And on that point, we're out of time. So I'd like to thank Kierstin and Stan and Kimberly for a great discussion.